They mocked him for years, calling him poor, strange, a broken old man living in nothing but a shack at the edge of town. Children laughed, neighbors whispered, and grown men jeered his face. But one day, after the cruelest taunts yet, he did something no one expected. He opened the door and let them inside. What they discovered shattered every assumption they had ever made. Would you have mocked him too, before seeing the truth he kept hidden all along? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. At the far edge of town, where the paved roads thinned into dirt and weeds rose tall in the fence posts, there stood a shack that most people pretended not to see. Weathered boards leaned against one another, as if they had long ago given up resisting the wind. The roof sagged under the weight of years, patched here and there with tin sheets that glimmered dully when the sun caught them. In winter, smoke curled from a narrow chimney, carried with a scent of burning oak that mixed with frost. In summer, the windows, always half open, revealed nothing but shadows. The man who lived there was older than he looked, though time and silence had etched deep lines into his face. His name was known, but rarely spoken. People in town referred to him only as that man in the shack. Children whispered about him on their walks home from school, daring one another to race past his fence and touch the leaning gate before bolting away in nervous laughter. To the grown-ups, he was an easy subject of ridicule. They said no man with any sense or pride would choose to live in a place like that when proper houses, painted and orderly, stood only a mile away. He was seen sometimes at the market, his step steady but unhurried, a cloth sack slung over one shoulder. He bought little: flour, salt, oil, a spool of thread. He did not linger, and he never spoke more than a polite word to clerk. Others in line would watch him carefully. Their voices lowered at first, then louder once he had walked out the door. They wondered why he stayed on the outskirts, where his age should have driven him closer to the town's comfort. Some said he was poor, living off scraps, too proud to ask for help. Others claimed he had gone mad after losing something or someone, and the shack was punishment he had chosen for himself. Yet for all their laughter and whispers, no one could deny he carried himself with a strange dignity. His clothes were plain but always clean, his boots patched carefully rather than discarded. He bowed his head slightly in greeting to those who dared meet his eyes, a small gesture that unsettled more than it soothed. There was a calmness about him, as if he knew something they did not. The shack itself became part of his identity. Its fence, barely holding together, kept no one out, yet nobody ever stepped beyond it uninvited. The path to his door was swept clear of leaves and debris, though no one ever saw him sweeping. The small garden at the side, lined with stones, grew herbs and vegetables in neat rows, each plant tended with patience. At night, the faint glow of lamplight could be seen through the cracks in the boards, steady and unwavering, as if the man within had no need for sleep. Still, the townspeople judged what they could not understand. In the bar on Friday evenings, men raised their glasses and joked about what secrets the shack might hold. They imagined filthy bedding, rats scurrying in corners, or cupboards bare but for a crust of bread. Women, walking home from church, shook their heads at the sight of him carrying firewood, muttering that no one should live in such conditions. Their children absorbed these judgments without question, repeating them in cruel games that revolved around daring each other to knock on his door. Through it all, the man remained silent. He never argued with the jeers that carried on the wind. He never corrected the stories whispered about him in the market aisles. He endured, as if the noise outside mattered little compared to whatever kept him anchored to that place. His shack, to the eyes of others, was nothing more than a symbol of failure. But to him, it was something else entirely, something he never tried to explain. He let the weather speak through the creaking boards, let the seasons write their stories on the walls. And behind the worn door, he continued his days in quiet rhythm, unmoved by those who mistook simplicity for shame. To anyone passing by, the shack looked like the end of a life. To him, it was the beginning of something no one else could see. The shack was never silent in the minds of the townspeople. Even when no one stood near its leaning walls, it lived in their conversations like an unspoken joke that never grew old. At the bakery in the mornings, while steam rose from fresh loaves, someone would mention seeing him hauling wood down the road, and laughter would ripple through the room. At the barbershop, where news traveled faster than scissors, stories of the supposed poverty or strangeness were retold with each new customer who sat in the chair. The words shifted and stretched with every retelling, but the meaning remained the same. A man who chose to live in a shack at the edge of town was surely a man to be pitied or mocked. Children absorbed the whispers long before they understood them. They gathered in groups near the road that led past his property, daring one another to step closer. Some would throw pebbles toward his gate. Their small clinks against the fence a kind of test of bravery. Others would creep up just far enough to press their faces against the slats and then run shrieking back, claiming they saw shadows move inside. These games were played with nervous laughter, but the stories they carried home grew larger than life. They spoke of strange noises at night, of shapes in the windows, of secrets hidden under floorboards. The shack became less a house in their minds and more a stage for their imagination. Adults, less dramatic but no less cruel, shaped their ridicule with softer words that cut deeper. A woman passing in the market would sigh loudly, remarking to her companion that no man should live that way. Farmers, seeing him walk past with his small cloth sack, would shake their heads and mutter that he had wasted his life, that even the poorest hand found better shelter. On Sundays, when families filed out of church in pressed suits and clean dresses, his absence was its own subject of conversation. Some claimed he stayed away out of shame, others that he could not bear the company of decent folk. Whatever the reason, his solitude only confirmed their assumptions. He heard these things. He always did. Words carried easily in a small town, and silence did not shield him from their sting. But he never answered. When a group of boys shouted insults as he passed them near the mill, he kept walking, his stride steady. When a shopkeeper smirked at the sight of his patched coat and muttered a joke meant to be overheard, he paid his bill with exact change and left without a word. His quiet became his own armor, a refusal to bend or explain, a wall stronger than the one of weatherboards that surrounded his home. The mystery of his silence fed the gossip more than any answer could have. Had he once been wealthy and fallen into ruin? Did he refuse offers of help out of pride? Was he hiding from something, a past mistake, a crime, a debt left unpaid? Each person added their own speculation to the growing pile, and the absence of truth allowed their tales to flourish unchecked. The shack became a mirror in which townspeople projected their own fears of loss and poverty, their own unease about what it meant to have less. It was easier to laugh at him than to wonder if their own fortunes might one day collapse in the same way. Still, for all their mockery, no one ever crossed the threshold. They might joke, but none dared step inside. Curiosity pressed against them, but fear held them back. The shack, fragile as it looked, seemed to command a boundary none wished to test. He kept his door closed, his curtains drawn, his life hidden behind walls the world believed to be falling apart. When eyes lingered on him too long, he gave only the briefest nod of acknowledgement and moved on. When laughter rose at his expense, he met it with silence that unsettled as much as it angered. In that silence, he carried something the others could not understand. A weight, yes, but also a dignity that no mocking could erode. He lived as though their words passed through him without landing, as though the shack itself absorbed the noise of the town and left him untouched. What the people saw as weakness was, in truth, a kind of strength they had never needed to learn. And so the whispers continued. The laughter echoed, and the shack at the edge of town remained a subject of speculation, a story told over bread, haircuts, and church steps. All the while, the man inside endured, unbending, waiting for a day when silence might finally speak louder than their voices. Morning began before the sun rose, before the first stirrings of the town could be heard in the distance. His shack, though small and weathered, came alive with the rhythm of his movements. He lit a lantern, even when dawn's light crept through the cracks, its glow steady on the table where he set down a mug of hot water steeped with herbs from his garden. The floorboards creaked under his steps, but the sound was not careless. Each movement seemed practiced, as though he were playing out a pattern that mattered only to him. He stepped outside with an axe in his hand, the handle worn smooth from years of use. The woodpile beside the shack stood neatly stacked, each log cut to almost identical length, each row aligned like soldiers. He split more, the sharp crack of the axe echoing across the fields. His motions were unhurried but exact, the blade falling with precision. It was not simply fuel for warmth that he was gathering. It was order, control, and a kind of meditation. Neighbors, if they ever happened to walk that way, would see nothing more than a lonely man chopping wood. They would not notice how he paused between swings, his eyes lifting toward the horizon as though measuring something only he could see. After the wood came the repairs. The shack, battered by years of storms, demanded constant attention. Shingles slid loose, boards warped under the strain of seasons, nails rusted and pulled free. He patched each flaw with quiet care. Some days he replaced planks along the walls, cutting them down to fit with an almost obsessive neatness. Other days he climbed the roof, hands steady despite his age, hammering replacements where the rain had chewed its way in. To others, it looked like desperation, a man clinging to a house long past saving. To him, every repair was par a whole, as though the structure were more than wood and nails, as though it were keeping alive something larger than itself. Behind the shack stretched a small garden. It was not large enough to provide everything, but it was tended with the devotion of someone who believed even the smallest patch of earth could hold importance. Rows of herbs stood alongside vegetables, their soil dark and carefully turned. Stakes supported vines that twisted upward with patient determination. He watered them with a bucket he drew from the well, moving along the rows slowly, checking each plant with a careful hand. Neighbors laughed about that garden, calling it pitiful, mocking how little it yielded compared to proper farms. They never noticed the patterns in its layout, the deliberate arrangement of plants, the way he rotated crops season to season, protecting the soil as though the ground itself were worth preserving. Each task flowed into the next with seamless rhythm. He sharpened his tools, checked the hinges on the doors, cleared the path leading from the gate to the porch. Inside, he polished a few objects he kept. A table carved by hand, a chair with smooth curves worn by years of use, a lamp whose glass shone spotless. He swept the floorboards daily, though dust always returned, and he folded his blankets with a precision that seemed unnecessary for a man living alone. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was left to decay without his intervention. To the casual eye, his life was nothing but small labors, the work of survival dressed as routine. Yet there was a hidden weight to his actions, a suggestion that each repair, each stroke of the axe, each planted seed was part of a discipline that stretched beyond mere need. It was as if he were maintaining more than a shack. It was as if he were maintaining meaning itself. His neighbors thought of him as strange for choosing such a life, but they never saw the quiet certainty in his movements. He lived as though every nail, every log, every drop of water in his garden carried significance in a world that had mocked him for less. He chose to remain steady, faithful to the rituals that bound him to the shack and whatever secrets it held within. And so his days unfolded in silence, ordered by routines that seemed ordinary but felt like ceremony. To those who laughed, they were chores of survival. To him, they were the language of a life carefully tended, a life that refused to crumble no matter how the world chose to see it. The boy had heard the stories for as long as he could remember. At school, the shack at the edge of town was spoken of in whispers, half-truths stitched together into daring tales. Some said the old man kept bones under his floorboards. Others claimed there were treasure chests hidden in the garden, while a few insisted he was simply mad, building things in the dark for no reason at all. To the boy, it was less frightening than fascinating. He had seen the man in town, carrying his cloth sack of supplies, his back straight, his eyes lowered, and there was something in that silence that seemed to hold more weight than the laughter people threw at him. So one afternoon, while the sun sank low and shadows stretched long across the fields, the boy followed the narrow path leading out to the shack. His steps were quick but careful. Every crack of a twig beneath his foot felt louder than it should, like a drumbeat announcing his intrusion. The fence loomed ahead, its posts tilting like tired sentinels, and the gate hung slightly open as though no one had touched it in years. The shack itself stood in its familiar posture, weathered walls bearing the scars of seasons, roof patched with mismatched tin. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, proof that the man was home. The boy hesitated, heart pounding, but curiosity urged him forward. He crept to the side, where a window leaned crooked in its frame. Pressing close, he tried to peer through glass, but the angle showed only shadows. He crouched lower, his hands against the siding, and shifted until his eyes caught a glimpse inside. For a moment, he thought he saw only dim light and clutter, but as his vision adjusted, details sharpened. A chair, not factory-made but shaped by hand, smooth curves carved with care. A table polished to a soft glow, its surface bearing faint patterns that seemed deliberate, not accidental. Tools hung neatly along one wall, their shapes unfamiliar. Not the common hammers or saws the boy had seen in his father's shed. They looked older, stranger, yet well-kept. He leaned closer, breath fogging the glass. Looking for something? The voice came from behind, calm but steady, and the boy froze. He spun around to see the man standing only a few feet away, his figure framed against a fading light. He held no weapon, no raised hand, just a quiet presence that carried more authority than anger ever could. The boy stumbled back, words tangled in his throat. I just wanted to see," he stammered, expecting to be shouted at, dragged away, or worse. Instead, the man regarded him with a steady gaze. "Most people do," he said, not unkindly. He stepped closer, his boots pressing into the soft earth, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. The boy wide-eyed and trembling, the man calm and unreadable. "Come here," the man said at last. His tone was neither command nor invitation, but something in between. Hesitant, the boy obeyed, moving slowly to where the man stood. To his surprise, there was no scolding, no demand to leave. Instead, the man gestured toward the window. "You saw the chair," he said quietly. "That was the first thing I ever carved here. Took me all winter." His voice carried no pride, only memory. The boy swallowed, uncertain if he should answer, but nodded. It looked different, not like the ones in town. The man's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close. Different is not always worse. He studied the boy's face for a moment, then turned and pushed open the shack's door. Warm light spilled onto the porch, revealing more than the boy had seen through the glass. "You may look, but you must be careful." Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood and oil. The walls, though rough on the outside, held shelves lined with objects, some tools, some carvings, some items whose purpose the boy could not guess. The floorboards were swept clean, and the furniture bore the marks of a patient hand. Smooth edges, careful joints, designs that seemed meant to last. On a shelf lay journals bound in leather, their spines cracked but cared for. Against another wall, a set of instruments gleamed faintly in the lamplight, too intricate for the boy to name. He stood in silence, taking it all in, while the man remained at the doorway, watching. There was no lecture, no explanation forced upon him, only the quiet presence of a man who allowed curiosity, without resentment. The boy finally turned, his voice hushed. "Why do you live here when you could?" He stopped himself, unsure the question was too bold. The man's eyes softened, though his answer was simple. "Because some things are worth keeping safe, even if others don't understand." The boy lowered his gaze, sensing the weight in those words, though he could not fully grasp it. He nodded once, then stepped back toward the door. The man let him go without another word. As the boy hurried down the path, heart still racing, he carried with him not fear, but wonder. The shack was no longer just a place of ridicule in his mind. It was something else, something he could not explain, but would never forget. The market was always alive with noise, voices carrying across the square, merchants calling out their prices, the clatter of carts as horses shifted restlessly in their harnesses. For most, it was a place of easy routine, where neighbors traded stories while buying bread or bartering over apples. But for the man from the shack, each visit was a quiet trial. He came rarely, only when his stores had run low, and he moved with a steady, deliberate pace, as though the weight of every eye upon him had long ago become familiar. His cloth sack hung over one shoulder, patched more than once, and his boots struck the cobbles with a rhythm that was unhurried but unshakable. When he appeared that morning, conversations faltered for a moment. Heads turned, then voices resumed. Some hushed, others raised just enough to carry. Children tugged at their mother's sleeves, whispering, "That's him," before being hushed. A pair of farmers leaned against their wagon, smirks crossing their faces as they watched him approach the stall where flour was sold. He waited in line quietly, his eyes lowered, his expression calm. Those ahead of him gave space, not from courtesy but from discomfort, as though his presence might stain their clothes. When his turn came, he asked for what he always did: a measure of flour, a small pouch of salt, a spool of thread. His voice was low, steady, polite. The shopkeeper wrapped his goods without comment, though his lips tightened as if the transaction were distasteful. Coins changed hands, placed carefully on the counter, and the man slipped them into a sack with the same measured movements he gave to every task. Behind him, laughter stirred. A group of men stood near the butcher's stall, their shoulders broad, their coats patched with dust and work. They spoke just loud enough for him to hear, their words cutting across the square like knives sharpened for show. "Must be nice, living like a king out there in his palace," one said, drawing out the word with a sneer. Another chimed in, his tone theatrical. "Oh, haven't you heard? That shack's got all the luxuries. Drafts in winter, leaks in summer, and rats to keep him company." The men chuckled, elbowing each other, pleased with their performance. The man from the shack kept his back straight, his shoulders unbowed. He did not turn, did not answer. He adjusted the sack on his shoulder and moved to the next stall, where he picked up a bundle of onions, the smell sharp and fresh in the morning air. The vendor handed them over without a word, glancing nervously toward the laughing men, as though fearing their mockery might turn on him. The jokes grew louder. "Betty sleeps on dirt and calls a feather bed," one shouted. Another added, "Probably keeps the wind out with old rags and prayers." Their laughter rolled across the market, drawing the attention of others who, though they said nothing, allowed the spectacle to continue. Some smiled uneasily, others looked away, but no one stepped forward. The man finished his purchases in silence. Bread, a handful of dried beans, a wedge of cheese. He placed each item into his sack, counted out his coins with careful fingers, and thanked each vendor softly. The jeers swelled around him, as though his silence gave the mockers more room to fill. He remained steady, unbroken, the calm center of a storm that tried and failed to provoke him. When at last his sack was full, he turned toward the road, leading out of town. His pace was the same as when he had arrived, measured and calm, though every step seemed to carry the weight of the laughter echoing behind him. The men's voices chased him across the square, calling after him with cruel cheer. But he did not falter. He reached the edge of the market, where the cobbles gave way to dirt. The voices grew fainter, swallowed by the distance, replaced by the sound of his boots striking the earth and the soft rustle of leaves carried on the breeze. He did not look back. He never did. Those who had witnessed the scene returned to their business, some shaking their heads, others still chuckling. A few, quieter than the rest, watched him disappear down the road with something unspoken in their eyes. Guilt perhaps, or unease, as though they sensed there was more to man than the laughter allowed. By the time he reached the path leading to his shack, the market was far behind him. The sack weighed heavy on his shoulder, but his expression remained unchanged. He crossed through the leaning gate and disappeared inside, shutting the door with a firmness that sealed him away from the world's noise. The laughter of the market might have mocked him, but within those weathered walls, his silence was a shield, and his dignity remained untouched. It was unusual for anyone to pause at the shack's leaning gate. Most passed it quickly, their eyes fixed on the road ahead, eager to be out of sight before the man inside appeared. But one late afternoon, as the light softened and the air grew cool, a woman lingered there. She was not from town by birth, though she had lived among its people long enough to hear the same whispers, the same half-mocking stories about the man who chose to remain apart. She carried herself differently from the others, with less haste and more thought, and perhaps that was why she had the courage to stop. The man was outside, tending to the rows of herbs in his garden. His hands brushed the soil with deliberate care, checking the roots, clearing away small weeds before they could spread. He did not look up when her shadow fell across the fence, but he seemed to know she was there. His movement slowed, and then, without lifting his head, he asked in his quiet way, "Something you need?" The woman hesitated. Her first instinct was to retreat, to leave before she intruded, but she stayed. "No," she said softly, "not something I need, only something I've wondered." He raised his eyes then, the lines of his face deep in the fading light. They were not unfriendly eyes, but they carried a weight that made most people turn away. She held his gaze. "Why here?" she asked at last. "Why live like this, when you might have more?" It was a question others had thrown at him in jest or scorn, but never with gentleness. From anyone else it might have sounded like ridicule, but her tone was quiet, curious, without judgment. He studied her for a long moment, then sat back on his heels, brushing soil from his hands. "People think they know what more looks like," he said slowly. His voice carried no bitterness, only a calm certainty. Walls painted bright, rooms filled with things bought in town, roofs that keep every drop of rain out. To them, that's more. To me, he paused, looking at the shack behind him, its walls uneven, its porch sagging. To me, more can mean something different. The woman leaned lightly against the fence, her hands folded before her. "But they say you have nothing here," she pressed gently, "that you live in poverty, that you hide from the world." He gave the faintest trace of a smile, the kind that disappeared almost as soon as it formed. "Nothing," he repeated, as though testing the word. He turned back toward the garden, his hand resting on one of the stakes that held a vine upright. "If nothing were all I had, I wouldn't still be here. What you see is only what stands on the surface. What matters," he stopped himself then, his voice trailing away, as though he had revealed too much. The woman waited, but he did not finish the thought. Instead, he stood, dusting his hands on his trousers, and looked at her once more. People are free to think what they like. It keeps them comfortable. Comfort is important. His answer was not an answer at all, yet it held enough weight to leave her unsettled. She wanted to ask again, to press further, but something in his calmness made her fall silent. She realized that whatever truth he held was not one he would give easily, and perhaps it was not meant for her to know. She nodded slowly, acknowledging the limits of his reply. "Thank you," she said simply, though she was not sure for what. Perhaps for the dignity with which he bore the question. Perhaps for the hint, just enough, that the life he lived was not as empty as others claimed. As she turned to leave, the man bent again to his work, the conversation already folded back into his silence. The shack stood behind him, unchanged to the eye, but in her mind it was different now. It no longer looked like a ruin clung to out of desperation. It looked instead like a choice deliberate and steadfast, even if the reason remained hidden. When she returned to town that evening, she found herself listening to the usual chatter with new ears. The laughter, the easy scorn, the dismissive words about the man at the edge of town, they sounded smaller than they had before. She said nothing to correct them, but she carried with her the memory of his calm voice, the sense that what seemed like poverty might in truth be something far richer, something no one else had thought to see. The storm came without mercy. By dusk the sky had turned a bruised shade of gray. Clouds stacked heavy above the town, as though the weight of them alone might crush the fields below. Winds rose first in whispers, tugging at shutters and rattling loose boards. But within an hour they were howling down the streets, bending trees low and driving dust into every crack. Rain followed, not in gentle sheets but in violent bursts, hammering rooftops and flooding the gutters until the cobblestones disappeared beneath a rushing current. The market awnings tore loose, sails pulled from their masts, and fences toppled as though they had been made of twigs. Families huddled in their houses, listening to the groan of beams strained beyond their strength. Children cried as water dripped from ceilings into hastily set basins. Roof shingles tore away one by one, clattering into the night before being carried off by the wind. By morning, whole yards were littered with debris. Porches sagged under the weight of fallen branches, and the town's pride in its tidy streets seemed washed away. When the storm broke at last, the air smelled of soaked earth and smoke from chimneys relit to dry out damp walls. Neighbors stepped out cautiously, assessing the damage with weary eyes. It was then, in those heavy hours after the violence had passed, that they noticed something strange. At the far edge of town, where the land sloped away and the road turned to dirt, the shack stood exactly as it had before. Not a single board had shifted. Not a single shingle had flown loose. The crooked porch sagged no more than it always had, and smoke curled steadily from the chimney, as if the storm had been nothing more than a passing breeze. Word spread quickly. As repairs began in the town square, people glanced toward the edge of the fields, muttering to one another. Some shook their heads, claiming it must have been a trick of the wind. "The shack is too low, too small," one said. "The storm must have passed over it." Others reasoned that its position on the slope had spared from the worst of the gusts. Still others laughed, saying it was luck. Bad fortune belonged to them, while the old man in the shack had somehow escaped. But the unease in their voices betrayed something else. The storm had shown them the weakness of their own sturdy homes, yet the shack they mocked for its frailty had endured without a scratch. No one wished to say it out loud, but the sight unsettled them. Their houses, painted bright and built with pride, had betrayed them under nature's weight, while the one place they thought would crumble first had outlasted the night untouched. The man himself made no remark on it. He walked into town 2 days later, as he always did when supplies ran low. His boots left prints in the drying mud. His sack hung from his shoulder, and his steps were as measured as ever. Eyes followed him from every corner of the square. Men fixing their rooftops paused, wiping sweat from their brows, and watched him pass. Women sweeping water out of their kitchens whispered to one another, noting the absence of dampness in his clothes, the calm that clung to him. No one asked him why his shack had stood when so many other homes had faltered. No one dared. Instead, they told each other stories to ease the discomfort. He must have nailed the roof down better than the rest. Perhaps his garden, low to the ground, shielded the shack's foundation. Maybe, some suggested, the place was so far gone already that the storm had nothing left to take. Each explanation felt thin, but it was easier than admitting they did not understand. The man gave them nothing to hold on to. He bought his flour, his thread, his onions, and left without a word. His silence offered no answers, only a mirror to their unease. By the time he disappeared down the road again, conversation in the square had returned to nails, beams, and cost of repair. Yet beneath it lingered the image of that weathered shack standing firm against the storm, untouched when their stronger homes had grown and cracked. At night, as they patched their roofs and hammered boards back into place, some found their thoughts wandering back to him. Perhaps it was luck, they told themselves. Perhaps nothing more. But the thought did not settle easily. The storm had left scars on their homes, reminders of how fragile comfort could be. And somewhere beyond the fields, the shack still stood, whole and steady, holding secrets behind its weathered walls that no one could explain. In the weeks after the storm, when the town was still mending fences and replacing shingles, whispers about the shack thickened like fog. People could not let it go. The way it stood untouched while roofs caved in and windows shattered across the square. The mystery unsettled them, and in their unease they turned to stories. Rumors grew where truth was absent, each one sharper than the last, until the shack was no longer just a place at the edge of town, but a vessel for every suspicion people dared to imagine. Some claimed a man had hidden something valuable inside, something worth protecting with more than boards and nails. Stolen wealth, they said, perhaps from years ago when no one knew what he had been before retreating into solitude. The suggestion spread quickly in the market stalls, murmured between weighed bags of flour and stacked crates of apples. Others whispered of buried gold, insisting that the man had unearthed a treasure in those fields and concealed it beneath his shack, shielding it from sight with his strange silence. When pressed, they admitted they had no proof, but proof mattered little. The storm had left them searching for explanations, and this one fit neatly into the shadows they had already drawn around him. There were darker theories, too. Some said he'd been a soldier once, that the shack contained secrets from a war no one spoke of anymore. Guns, maps, hidden documents, even bodies. Anything might have been locked away in that weathered place. Children overheard these tales and carried them into their games, their dares. In groups they crept along the dirt road toward the shack, hearts pounding as they drew near the leaning gate. One by one, they took turns rushing forward to rap their knuckles against the door before fleeing, their shrieks of laughter echoing behind them. None ever waited to see if the man would answer. For them the fear was a game, and the shack's silence only deepened the thrill. At night, when lamps glowed behind lace curtains, neighbors spoke of the shack with unease. They noted how the man carried himself, calm, unhurried, never bending under the weight of their eyes. They wondered if he guarded something he had sworn to keep hidden. They wondered if his silence was guilt, More than one claimed to have seen a lantern burning inside long after midnight, its glow steady, never wavering as though he were at work on something secret, while others slept. Through it all, the man himself gave them nothing. He walked to town only when he must, bought his supplies with the same care, and returned to the road without a word. When laughter or jeers followed, he did not turn. When children's knocks rattled against his door, he did not chase them off or call out. His shack remained closed, his garden tended, his woodpile stacked, and in that steadiness the rumors only grew louder. Silence, after all, was fertile soil for speculation. For those who mocked, it was easy to believe he was odd, perhaps dangerous. For others, quieter but no less curious, the mystery became something they turned over in their minds when days were long and work was slow. Was it possible that within those leaning walls something more than dust and solitude was kept safe? They had seen the shack survive what stronger homes could not. They had heard the children's nervous laughter as they returned from their dares. They had no answers, only questions, and questions demanded stories to fill the gaps. The man never corrected them. He let the words pass through the air like wind through trees, bending nothing, breaking nothing. To those who lived on gossip, his silence felt like defiance. But for him it was simpler. He knew that whatever they imagined about the shack, the truth was heavier, older, and not theirs to carry. So he endured their rumors as he endured their laughter, with the same quiet patience that had defined him for as long as anyone could remember. And in that patience, the mystery only deepened, leaving the town to speak louder, while he remained a still figure behind weather boards, unmoved by all the noise that circled endlessly around him. It happened on a morning much like any other. Though the air seemed sharper, the market noisier, the laughter more cutting than usual. The man had walked into town with his cloth sack slung over his shoulder, boots worn smooth by the long path he traveled each week. He moved with his usual calm. But that day the voices behind him carried louder, as though emboldened by the crowd that had gathered near the baker's stall. A group of men, their faces flushed with amusement, were trading barbs that rippled outward, drawing others into their circle. "There goes the king of rags," one announced, tipping his hat mockingly. "Does the palace need patching again?" Another joined in, his voice carrying across the square. "Careful with that sack. Might spill all the riches he's hiding, moldy bread and broken nails." The laughter that followed was sharp, unkind, the kind that leaves no space for dignity. The man said nothing at first. He paid for his bread, his onions, his thread, placing each coin carefully on the counter. But the voices did not quiet. Someone mimicked the sound of creaking boards. Another pretended to stumble as though tripping on a sagging porch. Children giggled, learning early how to scorn what their parents mocked. He turned then, slowly, his hand steady as he adjusted the sack on his shoulder. The laughter faltered when his eyes met theirs, not with anger, not with shame, but with something harder to name. He looked at them as if weighing whether their words mattered at all. Then, in a voice low but clear enough to carry across the market, he spoke. "Come," he said, "see for yourself." The square fell into silence so abrupt that even the horses stamping their hooves seemed to pause. The men who had mocked him stared, caught off guard by the simplicity of the words. No one had expected a response, and certainly not an invitation. For years he had endured their jeers without a word. Now, instead of defending himself, he offered them what they had never dared to ask. Entry into the shack they had built their stories around. One of the men forced a laugh, though it rang hollow. "See what? Dust and rats." The man's gaze did not waver. "Come," he repeated, softer this time, yet firm. "If you believe it, see it. If you doubt it, prove it." The market held its breath. Women carrying baskets slowed their steps to listen. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, eyes wide. Even the shopkeepers leaned forward, curious to see what would happen next. For so long, the shack had been a place of mystery and ridicule, but never an open door. Now that door was offered, and the ease of their mockery began to crumble. The men shifted uncomfortably under the weight of his calm. To accept the invitation meant crossing into a place they had only ever spoken of from a safe distance. To refuse meant admitting their cruelty was built on nothing but air. One of them cleared his throat, muttering something about being too busy. Another glance away, suddenly interested in the cobblestones beneath his feet. The man did not press them. He turned back to the stall, collected his change, and lifted his sack. But the words he had spoken lingered in the air long after he had walked down the road and disappeared from sight. Conversations that afternoon circled back to the same point again and again. He had invited them. He had nothing to hide, or so it seemed. By evening, the story spread beyond the market. In homes lit by lanterns, people whispered about it over supper. Some said it was a trick, that he wanted to humiliate those who stepped inside. Others insisted it was a sign of madness, a man grown tired of solitude who sought to drag others into his ruin. A few, quieter than the rest, wondered if perhaps they had been wrong about him all along. But none could erase the image of him standing in the market, calm against their jeers, offering an invitation no one had expected. He had turned their laughter back on itself without raising his voice, without striking a blow. And though they tried to dismiss it, something had shifted. The shack was no longer a distant object of ridicule. It was a question waiting at the edge of town, its door closed but no longer barred, daring them to cross a threshold they had mocked for too long. They came hesitantly, though they pretended otherwise. Pride would not let them admit the invitation had lodged in their minds like a burr. For days after the market, whispers circled through the town, swelling until curiosity became heavier than mockery. At last, a small group gathered, the very men who had laughed the loudest. They told themselves it was only to prove their point, to show that behind those crooked boards and sagging roofline, there was nothing but dust, cobwebs, and the smell of rot. They wanted to stand inside, confirm their story, and leave with more fuel for their ridicule. The road to the shack seemed longer than usual that morning. They walked together, each stride measured, each glance toward the others betraying the unease they denied. The shack appeared as it always had, squatting at the edge of the trees, gray and weather-worn, leaning as though ready to collapse. Its windows caught no light, its chimney sent no smoke. It looked, to all their eyes, exactly as they had always described it, unfit for living, a place barely holding together. The man was waiting at the door. He didn't greet them with words. He simply stepped aside, hand resting lightly on the worn wood, and nodded once. The silence that followed pressed against him harder than any scolding could have. One of the men cleared his throat. Another let out a forced laugh. But none moved forward at first. Finally, with a muttered curse, the boldest of them pushed the door open and stepped inside. The others followed, their eyes adjusting quickly from the daylight to the dim interior. What they found made them fall silent. The shack was no shack at all. Or rather, the shack was only skin, a shell concealing something entirely different within. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of cedar and oil. The walls were paneled in polished wood, every surface gleaming with careful care. Rows upon rows of shelves stretched across the room, each one lined with books whose spines bore titles in languages some of them couldn't read. Between the books sat objects, curious artifacts, carved figures, pieces of stone etched with markings, brass instruments that caught the faint light and glinted like quiet stars. Maps covered one wall, layered and overlapping, some drawn with careful ink lines, others weathered by time, their corners softened by age. Charts of seas, mountains, and territories stretched across the surface, annotated with neat handwriting. Tools, finely crafted, hung from pegs, each polished and ordered with precision. A large table stood at the center, its surface bearing delicate carvings along the edges. On it lay a spread of papers, compasses, and instruments for measuring, as though someone had been working late into the night and merely paused until morning. The men stood frozen, their mouths half open, searching for words that would not come. This was no place of poverty, no den of rot. It was a workshop, a library, a world stitched together by knowledge and skill. Everything in it spoke of care, patience, and long years of labor. The man moved past them quietly, setting aside his sack of supplies. He did not boast or explain. He simply placed the bread in a basket, the onions in a bowl, the thread into a drawer, as though their presence there meant nothing. His silence left them to grapple with what they saw. One bent slightly to study a globe in the corner, its surface marked with places unfamiliar. Another touched a hand-carved chair, running his fingers along the smooth grain, realized it was the work of someone with mastery, not desperation. A third stared at the books, whispering aloud the titles he could read, astonished to find them ranging from histories to sciences to poems. The longer they stood, the heavier the silence became. Their mockery, once so easy, had no place here. The shack they had laughed at was a mask, one they had been eager to believe in because it made them feel larger, richer, safer. But inside, the truth loomed over them, quiet, undeniable, greater than any story they had invented. Finally, one of them asked, almost in a whisper, "Why hide this?" The man looked at him, his expression unchanged. "Because you never cared to see," he answered. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but it cut deeper than any anger. The man had no reply. They shifted awkwardly, glancing once more at the shelves, the maps, the artifacts. Their curiosity was not satisfied. It had only grown, pressing it on them with questions they could not ask, not yet. The man offered no further words, no explanations. He simply allowed them to look, then gestured toward the door. They stepped back outside one by one, the sunlight blinding after the dim glow within. To anyone watching from the road, they looked the same as before, men leaving a shack at the edge of town. But their faces betrayed them. Stripped of arrogance, their eyes unsettled. For the first time, they realized the joke had always been theirs, not his. The shack had fooled them, but had not fooled him. And now, having seen inside, they could never laugh the same way again. The men had thought they had already seen everything the shack concealed. The shelves of books, the polished furniture, the maps and artifacts. They had been enough to silence their laughter and leave them unsettled. But as their eyes adjusted further, they noticed a narrow door at the back, partially hidden behind a tall cabinet. It was not locked, merely closed, as though waiting for those bold or curious enough to push it open. One of them reached for the handle, hesitated, and then glanced toward the old man. He gave no objection, no warning. He simply went on arranging his supplies, as if permission were unnecessary. The door creaked when it swung open, and beyond it was not darkness but light. A lantern glowed from a hook on the wall, illuminating a room none of them had imagined. It was a workshop, but unlike any they had seen before. The air smelled faintly of metal and oil, touched by the earthy scent wood freshly cut and shaped. The walls were lined with racks of tools, every one of them hand-carved, handles polished smooth from use. Their shapes were unfamiliar. Chisels with odd angles, saws with teeth arranged in intricate patterns, gears crafted from brass and wood, each one precise, as if pulled from a machine far beyond their understanding. On long benches lay machines in various stages of completion. Some were small, like boxes with tiny levers, their insides filled with interlocking wheels. Others were larger, with cranks, rods, and pulleys that suggested motion, though none of them could guess their purpose. A few seemed almost alive, as though they had only paused between breaths. The men leaned close, staring at pieces that spun freely with the gentlest push, marveling at how smoothly the parts fit together. One of them picked up a small object, no bigger than his hand. It looked like a clock, but its face bore not numbers but symbols, etched carefully into the metal. When he turned the side wheel, the arms rotated in complex, synchronized movements, as if measuring something he could not name. He set it down quickly, half in awe, half in fear. Against the far wall stood a larger contraption, an arrangement of pipes, rods, and gears connected to a central drum. Its surfaces were covered in markings, notes written in the same steady hand that had labeled the maps in the other room. The man who had built it must have spent years shaping each piece, testing each connection, refining the design. There was no sign of waste, no careless work. Every detail was precise, deliberate. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the faint ticking of some mechanism left running. The visitors looked at one another, and in their faces was the same dawning realization. This was no accident of luck, no strange collection of curiosities. The old man had built these things himself, in solitude, year after year. While they had mocked him as poor and broken, he had been laboring on machines they could not understand, crafting tools and inventions decades ahead of anything they had seen. One of them whispered, almost reverently, "How?" The old man finally stepped into the workshop. He did not boast or explain. He simply moved to one of the benches, lifted a small unfinished piece of wood, and set to carving. His hands moved with the certainty of someone who had done the same work for a lifetime, shaping the material as though it were an extension of himself. The men watched, transfixed, as shavings fell in soft curls to the floor. In the rhythmic scrape of the knife, they heard not poverty, but mastery. They began to understand what his routines had been for the chopping of wood, the mending of the roof, the tending of the garden. It had all been part of a larger order, a rhythm that allowed him to return here, to this room, and create. His silence was not emptiness, but focus. His solitude was not despair, but devotion. The visitors shifted uneasily, their pride hollow against the weight of what they saw. This workshop, hidden inside a shack they had mocked, was a world apart, a place where invention bloomed quietly, unseen, unpraised. It was as though the man had carried the future into the present, but chosen to live apart from those too blind to see it. When they finally left the room, they did so without a word. Their footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, their eyes lingering on the machines they could not comprehend. Outside, the shack looked the same as ever, weathered and frail against the edge of town. But to them it was transformed, no longer a symbol of mockery, but a mystery too vast to dismiss. They realized then that while they had wasted years laughing, he had been building something lasting, something that would remain long after their laughter had faded into silence. The men had thought the workshop was the heart of the secret, the hidden reason behind the man's long silence. They had seen the machines, the tools, the delicate inventions carved by his hands, and already their understanding of him had begun to unravel. But as they moved deeper into shack, past another narrow passage leading off in the workshop, they found yet another space, one that felt older, heavier, as though it had been waiting longer than the rest. Here the air was cooler, tinged with the faint scent of dust and ink. Rows of cabinets lined the walls, their drawers labeled in small, careful script. Stacks of bound journals filled shelf from floor to ceiling, their spines warm but orderly, each marked with a date. One of the men reached tentatively for a drawer, sliding it open with the same hesitation as one might approach a grave. Inside lay bundles of letters, tied neatly with faded string. The paper was yellowed, fragile, but the handwriting across it was clear, strong, deliberate strokes that spoke of a steady hand. Another cabinet revealed sketches folded carefully, diagrams of bridges, buildings, machines, each one detailed with measurements and annotations. Some showed places they recognized, old landmarks from distant towns or rivers where they had once traveled. Others depicted things entirely unfamiliar, structures that looked like they belonged to another age. As the visitors spread through the room, each pulled open drawers, turned the pages of journals, and unrolled maps that covered the tables. In them they found a record not of a hermit's small life, but of journeys that stretched across years and borders. There were accounts of cities, notes on landscapes, descriptions of storms at sea and mountain passes that froze men in their tracks. His words were not written for drama or acclaim, but with a quiet precision that captured the weight of experience. Every entry carried the tone of someone who had lived through struggle and survival, but who had chosen to set it down not for glory, but for memory. One journal described the construction of a bridge in a town none of them had visited, the details of how the supports were sunk deep into riverbed stone, how the arches bore weight against the current. Another told of weeks spent among miners in the mountains, where he sketched their tools and recorded their methods, learning as he went. Still others spoke of places ravaged by conflict, not in the loud words of battle, but in quiet reflections on the ruins left behind. Each page seemed to hold another life, another part of a man none of them had ever bothered to know. Among the papers were drawings of machines like those in his workshop, some never completed, some refined over years. The men saw how the ideas had grown, shifting with each attempt, lines erased and redrawn, concepts evolving in ink long before they were shaped in wood and metal. These were not idle scribbles, but records of devotion, each notebook building on the last, carrying forward a thread of thought that had spanned decades. One of the men found a letter, tucked away in an envelope whose seal had long since dried and cracked. It was written to someone named Clara, though no surname followed. The words were spare, but filled with a weight that caught him off guard. It spoke of leaving, of sacrifice, of building a future he might never see but hoped others would. There was no self-pity, no bitterness, only an acknowledgement that sometimes the world demanded a quiet retreat, not out of weakness, but out of choice. The man folded the letter back into its envelope with unsteady hands, unwilling to speak of it aloud. Slowly they began to understand the shape of the life this man had lived. He had once traveled, worked, sacrificed, perhaps even loved. He had built things that stood long after he left them behind. And then at some point he had chosen to withdraw, to settle in a shack at the edge of their town, bringing with him not failure, but a lifetime's worth of memory and craft. The shack, to them a symbol of poverty, had been his archive, a shelter not for a broken man, but for the record of all he had carried and all he had given. The men stood among the cabinets, their mockery silenced more completely than by the machines. In those pages and sketches, they were confronted with a truth they had not imagined, that the man they had ridiculed was not an odd recluse, but someone who had lived a larger life than any of them would likely ever know. The journals, the letters, the drawings, they were not secrets. They were simply the quiet evidence of a man who had lived fully, who had worked without demanding recognition, and who had chosen to spend his final years among his creations rather than among the voices of those who would never understand him. For the first time, they looked at the shack not as a disguise, but as a vessel. Every plank and nail, every cabinet and shelf was part of something greater, a sanctuary of memory, a place where one man's story had been preserved, not for the town, not for admiration, but simply because it was worth remembering. And in that silence, standing amid the archive, the visitors realized just how little they had ever truly seen. The further they walked into the heart of the shack, the more the air seemed to change. It was not the scent of wood shavings or old ink this time, nor the weight of machines or journals. What they entered now felt like stepping into a silence, so deep that even their breathing seemed out of place. The room was smaller, its walls lined not with shelves or cabinets, but with frames. The men stopped almost immediately, their voices caught in their throats as they realized what they were seeing. The portraits stretched across the wall in careful rows, each one painted or drawn by hand, each one bearing the face of someone who had once lived in the man's world. There were no labels, no plaques, no explanations, yet the likenesses spoke volumes. Some were faded sketches, made with charcoal and preserved behind simple panes of glass. Others were painted in oil, the colors still vivid despite their age. A young woman, her eyes dark and steady, looked out from one frame of the gaze, so calm it felt as though she was still watching over the room. Beside her was a small boy, hair tousled, smile caught in that uncertain space between childhood playfulness and the discipline of being still for a portrait. Next to him, a younger girl, no older than 6 or 7, held a book in her lap as though the artist had wanted to capture her in the act of learning. The visitors found themselves drifting closer, unable to resist the quiet pull of those faces. They could see the man himself in them, in the curve of a brow, the shape of a mouth, the tilt of the chin. These were not strangers. They were his family, long gone yet kept alive here through his own hands. One of the men whispered under his breath, though the sound seemed intrusive in the heavy stillness. He asked whether they had died young, whether illness or accident had taken them. No answer came, but the silence itself seemed to confirm it. The older man stood a step behind them, his eyes on the wall rather than on his guests. His expression was unreadable, not grief-stricken, not bitter, but marked with a quiet endurance that had grown over years. It was clear he had seen these portraits every day, that this wall was not decoration, but devotion. The shack, with its weathered boards and broken roofline, had always been mistaken by outsiders for neglect. But here inside, it became something else entirely. It was not a place of shame, but of preservation. Every nail that held the walls upright, every board patched and repatched, had been for this, protecting these faces, protecting the memory of those who had once filled his life with meaning. One portrait in particular caught the eye of the visitors. It showed the same woman from earlier, but older, lines around her eyes and mouth, hair tied back with a scarf. The strokes were softer, less precise, as though painted from memory rather than life. The men realized, with a quiet sting, that some of these works must have been done long after the family was gone. They were not all records of the past, but reconstructions, acts of remembrance created by a man who could not allow them to vanish entirely. His art was not for galleries or for acclaim. It was the only way he had to resist the erosion of time. As they studied the wall, another detail emerged. Along the bottom row were smaller frames, each one containing what looked like rougher sketches. These were not posed portraits, but fragments. Faces glimpsed in laughter, profiles caught mid-thought, hands holding tools, children running. They were quick impressions, drawn as though he had been trying to catch fleeting moments before they disappeared. The visitors began to understand that what they saw here was not just art, but a life preserved in fragments, pieced together through memory and longing. No one spoke loudly. Even the most skeptical among them felt their earlier cruelty shrivel into something sour in their throats. They had laughed at the shack, ridiculed its broken boards and sagging roof. They had whispered about madness, poverty, and failure. But none of that seemed to matter now, faced with the wall of portraits. This was no ruin. It was a sanctuary, carefully built and fiercely maintained. Its simplicity outside had never been a disguise for shame. It was a barrier, keeping out the world's noise and cruelty, so that what remained within could endure untouched. The old man finally stepped forward, not to explain, but to adjust a frame that hung slightly askew. His hand lingered there for a moment, fingertips brushing the glass with the gentleness of someone touching a living face. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The wall itself spoke more clearly than any defense could. It was love made permanent, grief made bearable, memory made solid. The visitors looked on, their mockery silenced not by fear or shame, but by the realization that they had mistaken strength for weakness, devotion for failure. The shack no longer looked small to them. In that moment, it seemed larger than their own homes, richer than any possession they might boast of. It was not the measure of a poor man, but the chosen vessel of one who refused to let those he loved be forgotten. The shift was almost imperceptible at first, the way the room drew breath without sound. Those who had followed him inside, driven by a mix of mockery and disbelief, now stood without their usual bravado. The jeers and snide remarks that had echoed so confidently at the market or in the tavern were gone. Instead, silence held them, thick and weighty, pressing on their shoulders as their eyes wandered over every surface of the shack's interior. What they had expected to find, squalor, disarray, evidence of failure, was nowhere to be seen. In its place stood order, intention, and a quiet history so profound that words seemed clumsy in its presence. Some of the men shifted uncomfortably, as though their boots were suddenly too heavy on the carefully tended wooden floors. Others stared at the portraits, their eyes lingering on faces they did not know, but now felt unable to ignore. The children, usually the quickest to laugh, fidgeted in uneasy silence, their usual daring reduced glances stolen when they thought no one was looking. Even the woman who had once shown kindness felt herself hushed, not by intimidation, but by a kind of reverence that had crept upon her without warning. The old man did not stand before them like a lecturer or a figure demanding attention. He moved among the spaces of his home as though no one else were there, his hands brushing over frames on the wall, pausing to adjust a corner of a rug, or resting on the back of a chair he had built decades ago. He did not explain, did not justify, did not narrate. He simply existed within the space, allowing the room itself to do what words could not. Every detail, every carved edge of the furniture, every careful stack of journals, every portrait preserved in silence was a testament. The visitors realized they were in the presence of something they had never cared to see, a life not wasted, but distilled, every effort poured into memory and meaning. They remembered their laughter then, but in memory it sounded thin, cruel, and small. They recalled the times they had pointed from a distance, children daring each other to knock, grown men boasting of the jokes they'd made at his expense. In this space, however, those moments of mockery shrank to nothing, exposed as the shallow cruelties of people who never thought to look deeper. The weight of their past behavior pressed down hard, and none of them dared to meet the old man's eyes. One of the men, who had spoken the loudest at the market only days before, opened his mouth as if to say something, perhaps an apology, perhaps a fumbling attempt to justify himself. But the words withered before they found air. Nothing seemed adequate. His silence stretched, and in that silence, his shame was clearer than any confession. The others saw it and knew it as their own. Each of them carried the same unease, the same quiet reckoning. The old man finally looked at them, but his gaze was steady, unaccusing. It was not the look of someone triumphant or vindicated, but of someone who had endured so long that judgment no longer mattered. His silence was not weaponized, not a punishment. It was simply the continuation of the life he had always led, unbothered by their scorn, anchored in his own truth. And in that calm, their shame deepened, for it was not anger that confronted them, but dignity. The crowd stood in stillness, each person wrestling with what they saw and what it demanded of them. For some, guilt rose sharply, memories of laughter at his expense cutting deeper than they ever imagined they could. For others, all settled in, a growing respect for what he had preserved within walls they had dismissed as worthless. A few felt something stranger still, a sense of loss, as though they had wasted years looking past a man whose quiet presence might have taught them more than they had ever known. No grand speech followed. He did not recount tragedies or demand acknowledgement. The shack, with all its hidden treasures of memory, invention, and devotion, was enough. It stood as his voice, his testament, his answer to every sneer and every whisper. The room itself spoke louder than words, telling of a life built not for applause but for preservation, not for wealth but for meaning. When the visitors finally stepped back outside, the air of the town seemed different. They walked without their usual chatter, their eyes averted from one another, each lost in their own thoughts. The children no longer dared each other to peek through windows, and the adults no longer spoke with the easy cruelty of before. A quiet reckoning had taken root. And though no one said it aloud, they knew the silence would linger. The laughter that had once followed the man wherever he went had died within those walls, replaced by something heavier and more enduring. They had entered mocking, but they left with their voices gone, their judgments dismantled by a truth that required no defense. The days that followed were quieter than the town had known in years. The old shack at the edge of the fields no longer carried the same weight of gossip or derision. Instead, it stood like a monument that people now passed with lowered voices, their once easy laughter replaced by something closer to reverence. The man himself changed little. He rose at dawn, tended his garden, sharpened his tools, and followed the rituals that had carried him through countless seasons. Yet one thing was different now. The door of the shack was no longer closed. It began without announcement. One morning the neighbors noticed it. Open just enough to see the dim light within, the warm glow of a lantern brushing across the threshold. At first, no one dared to step inside again. The memory of what they had seen lingered strongly, and people passed by in hesitant silence, unsure whether the open door was an invitation or simply the habit of an old man who had grown careless. But the truth was neither. It was a gesture, quiet and deliberate, that required no words. He left the door ajar because he had nothing to hide, because secrecy was never his intent. What had once been his sanctuary could now, if others wished, be a place of humility and reflection. The first to return was the boy who had once crept near the windows out of mischief. His courage had been sharp then, but now it came laced with something else, respect. He stepped onto the porch, pausing at the threshold, waiting as though seeking permission. The man simply nodded, returning to his work at the table. The boy entered and sat quietly, eyes wide, hands folded, as though afraid to disturb the stillness. In time, he began to ask questions, not the bold, prying ones of children eager for secrets, but careful inquiries about tools, about books, about how things worked. The man answered with patience, teaching without ceremony, passing on fragments of the knowledge that had been shaped in solitude. Soon after, others followed. The woman who had once been the only one to show kindness returned often, bringing bread or jars of preserves. She never asked for explanations, only sat at the small wooden table and listened. Farmers came in evenings, rough hands folded on their laps, their eyes moving slowly over the books and portraits, as though searching for lessons that had escaped them in their own lives. Even the men who had mocked them the loudest found their way back, each of them uneasy at first, their shame still heavy. They came not in groups this time, but alone, as though to prove to themselves that they were willing to stand in that silence without the safety of laughter. The shack became something the town had not expected. It was no museum, no shrine in the formal sense, but it carried the weight of both. Children who once dared each other to knock now walked in respectfully, their laughter subdued, their curiosity guided by awe. Mothers told them to watch closely, to learn how patience and craft could shape a life. The shack no longer symbolized poverty or strangeness. It became a quiet school of humility, where those who entered left with more than they had brought. The man never demanded respect, never asked for apologies. He simply left the door open, day after day, allowing those who wished to enter the freedom to do so. Each visit chipped away at the easy cruelty that had once surrounded him. Every respectful glance, every hushed voice, was a silent acknowledgement that they had been wrong. The shack itself became a rebuke, not in anger, but in truth. Its walls contained a life lived with depth, and its open door reminded the town that judgment had always been their own failing, not his. Seasons changed. The roof weathered storms, the garden bloomed and withered, and the man aged further, his hands slower but still steady. Yet the shack no longer felt isolated. It breathed with the comings and goings of neighbors who no longer saw him as an oddity, but as a keeper of something they had nearly overlooked. When he sat in his chair by the open doorway, watching the path that led from town, there was no bitterness in his eyes. What he had endured had been replaced by a quiet fulfillment. The knowledge that what he had preserved would outlast him, carried not in books alone, but in the altered hearts of those who once mocked. The door remained open, even when he was not near it, even when night fell and the lantern burned low. It was an invitation, a lesson, and a legacy. And for the townspeople, it was a reminder that behind the simplest facades can rest the deepest truths, waiting only for eyes willing to see.